In the simplest terms possible, an mDL is the electronic data carried on a mobile device that represents a physical DL credential that would have been issued to that individual. To put it slightly differently, an mDL is trustable data that proves someone is who they claim to be, can prove they're being bound to that trustable data, and has the associated privileges. In the case of a driver license, the privilege to drive. When asked what does an mDL look like, the answer is you can't really see it because it's the zeros and ones being carried, transmitted, and verified. Next slide. What we've struggled with from the very beginning with our work is the inclination to render a photo or image of a credential and then subject the relying party communities to the roulette of whether what they're seeing is trustable. Cutting to the chase, we didn't want to perpetuate the issues we have in the physical credential realm, much less make the situation even easier for those with the intent to commit an ID-related crime. Next slide, please. The functional requirements are really the what an mDL is, and my fellow panelists will be diving deeper into this as well as looking at the how. At the outset, we've had both security and privacy in mind. Far better to integrate those into every step along the way than to finish the work and then wrestle with how do you make things secure and privacy centric. Next, mDLs need to confirm the holder's identity. They also need to convey whatever the associated privileges are. In this case, to drive. They also need to be trusted. They need to be interoperable. From the very beginning, the jurisdictional folks that led the way in this knew that if they created mDL solutions that only work within their own jurisdictions, that it would not be accomplishing what they'd set out to do. Not only should it work outside of the issuing state or province, ideally it will work anywhere around the world. They need to promote data minimization. The holder should not have to overexpose their personally identifiable information. They should be in control of how much information they release and to whom. mDLs will ultimately work both in person-to-person scenarios as well as a person-to-a-kiosk, online, or other unattended scenarios. mDL holders need to be able to remove the credential, and issuing authorities need to be able to keep the credential attributes updated. For example, a change of address, a change in status, the addition or removal of an endorsement and/or restriction. And lastly, they need to be able to work without an online capability. Next slide, please. The mDL standardization has been going on for many years, and a significant list of countries have been actively participating. The heart of the work has really been done inside of ISO SE 17WG10. In the last couple of years, the ISO committee that's working on mobile identity, which is SE 17WG4, has joined forces and has taken up the mDL use case as their first primary area of focus. Next slide, please. From a motor vehicle authority perspective, ANVA was quite pleased that there are so many other geographic regions that are working cooperatively on aligning to the work of ISO. Counterpart associations in both Europe and Australia have mirror activities to the ones inside of ANVA and have been coordinating on proofs of concept, interoperability tests now for the past 2 years.
So for many, many years, jurisdictions have spent millions of dollars to secure the data on physical credentials using overt, covert, and forensic card security features that are designed to prevent tampering and show if a card has been compromised. The physical card has been a great asset for proof of identity and driving status, but there are some limitations, and Jeff alluded to some of those just a few minutes ago. Physical cards are only as accurate as they were the day they were issued and left the office. Changes in identity information, i.e. address or driving restriction changes, are not reflected on the card unless the holder obtains a replacement. For the holder to prove identity, they must hand over the card that has all, and I say again, all of their identifying information, which in many cases is scanned or copied for proof. When jurisdictions began to gather requirements for the mDL, we wanted to ensure that what we settled on was privacy-centric and had built-in data protections and was an improvement over the current physical card. These are designed to be foundational and be foundations of an mDL solution that is provided by our vendor community. This also leaves room, though, for customization by the vendor community or the issuing authorities. So the main tenets that we were looking at were that the mDL had to have the ability to confirm identity and convey driving privilege. This is the backbone of a driving credential. You need to know who the person is that has the credential and whether or not they're allowed to drive the vehicle they're in or at the time they're driving. I know this is an obvious thing, but when you're gathering requirements, you have to state everything so that you don't miss something. Privacy of the mDL holder and security of the data is also extremely important. In fact, as Jeff mentioned before, privacy and security was the base tenet that everything else was generated around. So that means that any requirement that we published must adhere to the privacy of the mDL holder, as well as the security of the data used to provision the mDL. Privacy of the mDL holder includes the inability to track their mDL usage. You should not be able to determine when the mDL was used nor where it was used. And for an example, I'll use myself. You shouldn't be able to tell that Mike McCaskill used his mDL to prove his age at his local liquor store 5 times this week during the COVID-19 issue. That's just something that we can't have. Privacy also includes the holder's ability to only release the data they wish to release, as Jeff mentioned before. Only releasing the information that I am over 21 and authorized to make the age-restricted purchase doesn't give the relying party, the liquor store clerk in this case, any more information than they need to complete the transaction. No personal data was released, minimizing the possibility for identity theft or fraud. Next slide, please. Interoperability was also a very important piece of this. With the physical card, interoperability is not an issue since the acceptance of the driver license or identification card is a visual process. You compare the photo on the license to the person standing in front of you and make your determination as to whether or not that is that person's credential. With an mDL, there must be a way for all relying parties to consume the data electronically. This is accomplished by solutions following the ISO 18013 Part 5 standard. And interoperability is not just in particular jurisdictions, but across all jurisdictions, both in the US and globally. The credential must be trustable. The relying parties must be able to trust the mDL. Trust that the mDL was issued by the issuing authority. Trust that the data is authentic and can validate the data with the issuing authority if needed, if the need arises. And these would be in cases where you have high dollar transactions in a bank or purchases of controlled substances in a pharmacy. The mDL also has to be able to work offline. This is especially important in a law enforcement arena where law enforcement are in remote areas without cellular coverage. There are instances where either the mDL or the reader are not connected to a network and therefore cannot validate data with the issuing authority. In these cases, the ability to validate that data, that the data was issued to the holder by the issuing authority, is still a main requirement. And then we also have to have the ability to manage the mDL remotely. The data must be updated in real time, and any changes to an identity or driving privilege must be updated to the mDL when they are changed in the system of record. Therefore, we have the most up-to-date information sitting on the mDL at all times. Jurisdictions must have the ability to remove an mDL from a device if needed also. In the circumstance where an mDL was obtained under fraudulent circumstances, the jurisdiction needs to be able to remove that mDL upon notification. Next slide, please. In conclusion of all this, the requirements are the required elements for an mDL. If any one of these were left out of an mDL solution, it can't really be considered an mDL.
So I want to dig into how it is, what are the mechanisms that fulfill those requirements, and how it is that you can trust an mDL. And I think trust is the key issue from the perspectives of all of the participants in an mDL transaction, in a driver's license transaction, from the holder, from the verifier, and then as well from the issuer as well. So key thing, and reiterating what Jeff had said, this is not an image rendered on the face of the phone, and it's not a picture of the license taken. There's too many ways and too many tools that allow you to create, false images and to show them to somebody on the screen. In the physical card world, we have security features that are on a license, and when you are handed a license and you touch it and look at it, you can sort of get an idea of the security features on there. And even still, many of those security features can be replicated in false IDs. So as we go into the mDL world, we have to move away from that particular usage and take a look more at, as Jeff had said, so the electronic data being trustworthy and presented in a way that the verifier can trust. Go ahead. So how do we implement that? The mechanism by which the ISO 18013-5 standard was created is that through that ISO Working Group 10, there's started and it has grown to well over 50 companies that represent issuing authorities, associations, all of the major phone platform vendors, and then also vendors in the space, and then also some relying parties in the space. So this group has gotten together and figured out how to start to standardize these transactions so that we meet the requirements that were outlined earlier. And again, the key thing, citizens should have control over their personal data. That privacy piece is the cornerstone. It's the starting point for how these get implemented. The concept here is that essentially the issuers electronically sign the data elements to move them to the device of the consumer. So you can think of this as an electronically signed document or individual electronically signed elements that we've placed into the citizen's control. And the relying parties need multiple ways that they can obtain the data so that it fits their business flow. And then also they need to be able to trust that data. You need to verify that the data came directly from the issuing authority. So all of these things come together in this ISO 18013-5 standard. And I'll sort of explain some of the mechanisms. You can go ahead to the next slide. Key thing here is that a mobile driver's license sort of creates an ecosystem. There's a lot of talk about identity ecosystems. This essentially creates ones. The issuing authority signs this data as being valid and provisions it to the citizen's mobile device. The citizen gains control of that, and the mDL holder or the user, and they have services that they want to request that require them to have a government-backed identity. The verifiers essentially read and validate that data similarly to how they do with the physical cards. They need to know that this came from an issuing authority. And they use that to sort of lower their risk or to fulfill compliance that they have. And they also may have a relationship with the issuing authority. So as we go to the next sets, as the next things kind of phase into these slides, think back to the list of functional requirements that Jeff had on his slide and the list of jurisdictional needs that Mike put on his slides, because I can kind of show you how each of these is met by the trust mechanisms in the ISO standard. Go ahead. So the issuing authority uses a private key to electronically sign each of the data elements in the mobile driver's license. So everything that you see on the face of the card, in addition to some management information, is electronically signed by the issuing authority and then provisioned down onto the citizen device. They use the private key essentially to sign that, and protecting that private key is essential to the security and trustworthiness of the system. Sorry about that. It's homeschool time. The public key then for that signature becomes available. That is the signer certificate that the issuing authority makes available. This can be freely distributed, and this is how the verifiers actually check the signatures on the data. Go ahead. These signer certificates in groups can be distributed in what's called a master list. These master lists can be assembled by issuing authorities, by associations. You can get them from vendors. These master lists represent a collection of public keys from trusted issuers. Go ahead. Can you go ahead to the next slide, to the next piece? So then the ISO standard, the ISO standard specifies what these master lists look like and what the signer certificates look like, and then also how the mechanisms, plural, for how data goes from the citizen device, from the mDL holder, to the reader device. And there are multiple of these mechanisms. There's NFC, there's Bluetooth for short-range distance, there's Wi-Fi aware, and then there's also, in this, as you can see the leg on the right-hand side here, there's what we call an online model. So if the devices are online, then the verifier can go and request from an API at the issuing authority to get the up-to-the-date information after the citizen approves that release. Now, if the devices are offline, then the standard supports these multiple mechanisms for data to be transmitted over the local channel. In either case, the verifier can use the public keys from a master list to verify that the data that they've received is intact, has not been altered along the way, and that it came directly from the issuing authority that they expect. And they can verify each of those things, put that little check mark, and run the transaction. So when the ISO Working Group 10 was looking at how we fulfill the different use cases, we gathered together a list. It's really a subset of the things that we do with driver license and ID documents, daily or over the course of our lives. We had certain things that we wanted to be in scope, certain things that we wanted to sort of move quickly to the market with, and then other things that were future planned items. Key to any of these is what was said before, selective release of information or data minimization. This is the holder having control and the holder being able to approve the release of only those data elements that are required for any of these use cases above. So for instance, as with an age-restricted item, you don't necessarily need to know the name or the address of the person who's there purchasing. You simply need to know that it came from an issuing jurisdiction, that it's unexpired, that their age is over 21. So the standard allows for that minimization, allows for that consent to sharing the data at the request and release of the data. So there are certain things that are in fact out of scope in the ISO in this particular standard. Provisioning, deleting, or updating the data, while those are jurisdictional needs, they're not standardized in ISO 18013. They will be standardized in the future through another ISO standard, 23220. But in day one, in this first release, they're not. That ability to show the driving privilege is not trustworthy, is not something that will be standardized, short of there being sort of a trusted screen execution environment, similar to the trusted computing execution environments, similar to being a trusted screen where nobody can kind of break into what's written on the screen. That will not be standardized. And then, so then we looked at, okay, all of these use cases, we can fulfill all of these use cases with what's called day one of the ISO standard, which includes the features that I talked about on the previous slide. The ability to use NFC or QR code to kick off a transaction, the ability to use NFC or Bluetooth or Wi-Fi aware for an offline transmission of the data, or the ability to use a web API or in fact OpenID Connect for the online. We can fulfill each of these use cases using those transmission mechanisms. And we've scoped this so that in the first day one release, it is expected that these will be attended operations. There will be a person who can take a look at the photo, see that the photo was signed by the issuing authority, and verify the identity of the person to that. We anticipate in day two being able to move towards an sort of unattended operation, being able to move towards having automated user authentication. And as well, the sort of distance is scoped down to those initial two NFC tap and the QR code reading that restricts the distance at which these can start down a little bit. And those are the concepts by which we're able to roll out this day one of the ISO standard, which is available now. You can download versions of it now, and then also the then as we're working on the day two, and that day one version should be finalized as a final international standard this year.
Will mDLs actually be replacing the physical document? Jeff, can you answer that?
Yes, Randy, thank you, and thank you for the question. I think it's important to keep in mind that at the outset for the issuing authorities, at no point was it assumed that they would be at a fork in the road and having to make a choice in their programs on, do they continue doing physical documents or do they start doing these mDLs. Every single conversation that took place and continues to take place is one where, in addition to the physical documents, people are looking at programs to start doing mDLs, and at the option of their customer, not as a mandate. And so it really is not being treated as or looked as a replacement or in lieu of. It is something in addition to.
For law enforcement, privacy rights often get in the way of effective law enforcement. So how do you balance the two in mobile driver's licenses?
That's a great question, and thank you for the question. So there's two things that we need to keep in mind here when I answer this question. The first is, Jeff brought this forward just a few minutes ago. We are in an optional world with mDL at the moment. So with anyone who has implemented an mDL solution, the person who holds the mDL is also still required by most state law, and in fact, I think it's all state laws, that they carry their physical card, the plastic driver license. So in a law enforcement situation where a person refuses to hand over their mDL or to allow the officer to consume or read the mDL, the officer can ask for the plastic, just like they do today. That's not going to change. So for the foreseeable future, those two options will still be available. In a situation where the officer is asking for your license and you do provide the mDL, that the law enforcement officer is entitled to all of your data, and therefore there will be a part of the mDL solution would be that you would provide that data to the officer in the transaction. Yes, the mDL holder still gets to choose whether or not they do that at a traffic stop. But again, if they choose not to provide the mDL data, They're still required by law if a law enforcement officer asks to provide the plastic.
Do mDLs work on all phones? And part two of that is, why is it important that the mDLs support multiple digital data interfaces like NFC, Bluetooth, and QR code?
So the mechanisms that are supported for the interchange of data, like to set up the connection, which is NFC and QR code, and to transmit the data, again, NFC, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi Wear, and then the online model, which is the internet connection models. All of those mechanisms are available on multiple cell phones, moving very back very far in the history of the sort of hardware. They're supported at the hardware level. There are some operating system changes required, but this should mean in some instances, like Wi-Fi Wear, and in other instances, there are none that are required. So as far as supporting phones, like back in the history of phones, we should be able to roll this out, supporting a very wide range of transmission mechanisms on multiple different devices. And then again, these are as well available on both of the major platforms, plus in some of the other, plus other phone platforms, or all of the major phone platforms. These mechanisms are available on each of them. And then since the platform vendors have been involved in the process of this standardizing these, they also have revisions. And you can see there are some posted public news about identity credential APIs for supporting these. So support should be very wide. The second part of the question, was why it's important to have the multiple different transmission mechanisms. And to me, it's very important to have those because the verifiers will have different scenarios in which they want to obtain the data and trust the data from the mDL. And they've got existing equipment that they've put in place. They have security requirements for whether or not they can be connected to the internet at that point of service. So having the different profiles, and really more importantly, having all of the mDLs that roll out, issuers choosing mDLs that support all of these different transaction mechanisms, it sort of encourages the ecosystem, the usage to flourish, and allows the verifiers to choose how they will accept identity.